Our scripture reading this morning is from Exodus 13, 17, 18, and 19. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through Palestine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt, ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. The word of God for the people of God.
Joseph first heard the request from his father. Israel, or Jacob, is his name. I am about to die, his father said. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. As you recall, Joseph had been in Egypt, not by his own design, but God allowed for that to happen in a way that he was there to be a refuge for his people in the land of Canaan as a famine came. And sure enough, Joseph was there, and eventually all of his brothers, and indeed then his father, came to Egypt. And that is when his father made that request, and Joseph did it. When his father died, they had days of mourning in Egypt, and then Joseph took his father's bones back to the land of Canaan and returned to Egypt. Then Joseph made the request, as he was in Egypt as well as the other people of God. Joseph made the request, when God takes you and rescues you from this place and brings you out, take my bones with you, that they may lay in that land that God has promised, the land of Canaan. And what we read today is the Exodus has happened. God has freed his people. He's trying to shape them into a people that would be called God's people. They would understand what that would mean. God would dwell with them. They would come to know God. And as they come to know God, they would come to obey God's word and be shaped by God. But on their way out of Egypt, Moses makes sure that they don't forget the bones of Joseph. And this don't forget the bones is just a way to try to let that cautionary reminder get into our ears and maybe down a little bit deeper. And today I want to talk about don't forget the bones in relation to Memorial Day, an American holiday. And then at the very end, I have some specific things, just a little bit, for the people of God in terms of what this cautionary reminder means to us. So what does this cautionary reminder, don't forget the bones, have to do with Memorial Day? Understand that every tribe, every people, every nation has a story. Maybe you would call it history, but from that is a more powerful term, their own story. A nation's story is forged over generations of shared experiences, whether those experiences are good or bad, and surely they are both. That people's, nation's story is forged over those generations, from the events, from the memories, from the perceptions, from the wisdoms, from the values, from the aspirations, from the fears, from the customs, from the institutional and political developments. They all shape a people's story. And know that it is a people's or a nation's story that makes people into a people. People into a people. More than just a collection of strangers, more than uneasy mishmash of conflicting enemies but a people who have lived together, stayed together, and will walk with each other into their future together. It is our American story that makes the American people. It's our American story that shapes our future together. If the American people come to a point where we no longer have an American story, we will cease to become a people at all. We will just be an assortment of persons or tribes or fiefdoms that happen to reside in this land and are in competition with one another. And that is why we must hear the caution that we are to remember our American story. And on Memorial Day, it's a national day of remembrance in which we don't forget the bones. The bones of our soldiers who were called into duty in our times of military conflict and gave their lives to the service of the American people. And so on this Memorial Day, we honor and give thanks to these, our soldiers, for their sacrifice to us and to our future as the American people. Their memory has become a part of the American story, and therefore we must not forget them. And so that is what Memorial Day is for. And it's a necessary part of us continuing together as a people, tied together by our stories, and now moving into future generations with a story intact. Note, though, to enrich this sense of our American story, that Memorial Day happened and developed after the Civil War. And what is interesting is that it soon enveloped both sides of that conflict. Were a part of the Memorial Day celebration. Both sides. How could that happen, that both sides would be part of the same American story? I know that in our American story there are low points, there are regretful parts, and even sinful calamities that are a part of our American story. Certainly, slavery is a sinful, injurious, and ugly part of the American story. And the racism that was developed to support that economic servitude, that has become such that there are now, and have been for a long time, many ugly Americans who have paid attention to the racism and have fallen victim to that part of our American story. But here's the thing. The soldiers on both sides of the Civil War were our soldiers. And both those who fought for the North and those who fought for the South are a part of our American story. And out of that conflict, God gave us, who are a part of the American story, a remarkable judgment that we needed. Abraham Lincoln would say it itself. This armed, violent conflict between different parts of the American family was a judgment upon America for allowing slavery to exist and to continue. That judgment is a blessing from God, because out of that judgment of the Civil War, the practice of slavery was done away with. That's a gift of judgment. But also in the Civil War, there were gifts of God's redemption. For one, slavery was excised from our future by God's judgment, and now the redemption of the people, American people, at least gained a foothold out of that conflict. And one aspect of that foothold of God's redemption for America is the liberation of Americans who literally were a part of being in that slavery. And also, a part of that taking shape for redemption is the liberation of those who held long, sinful, and binding attitudes that led to the enslavement of fellow Americans in the first place. And so God has begun that course of redemption, and it continues. It was a gift of God in the American story that came out of Americans being on both sides of a battlefield. And at the end of that conflict, God gave us a great gift of God's grace. God helped us, coming out of the Civil War, embrace each other. Both North and South, blue and gray, Yankee and Confederate, and also former slave and former slave holder. We became, out of God's grace, are moving towards brothers and sisters, embracing each other, all as seeing each other a part of the American family, a part of the American people, a part of the American story. And I know that sometimes we are just holding on each other by a finger or by bumping elbows. But brothers and sisters, we are holding together. Nobody is cut out of the American story. And one of the remarkable things about this memorial story is it tells us that we are still holding on together. And no matter which side of that conflict or which side of that injustice of slavery, we are still together, still a family. And our future is together. We who claim and share the American story are all Americans. And it's why we need to remember our story. So what's this word about don't forget the bones? How does that relate to us remembering our American story? It's a literal picture, don't forget the bones, of our desire to hold in memory those who share our American story. It began to form in World War I. In World War I, we ended up sending thousands of troops over continental Europe to fight in what was then thought to be the Great War, the war that would end all wars. It didn't do it. But we sent our soldiers there. And among that was General Pershing, who was ahead of course, the leader, general in charge of all the military forces. And he recognized in his first encounter of some Americans dying, and it touched him so deeply, he began to think, would it be right to make sure that the bodies of our soldiers would be brought back to the United States for whom they were fighting in freedom? Now, it wasn't a common desire. Soldiers were found. We made sure that the bodies, we could find as many as we could find, and we took the bones and we buried them in interment in military cemeteries throughout Europe. And to bring them back home would entail digging up these cremains, these bones, and bringing them back to the United States. And not everybody wanted that to happen to their sons or their daughters who died. Finally, the War Department announced in October 1919 that what it would do was survey each of the fallen soldiers' next of kin, to let those families and next of kin to decide whether they would want the literal bones of their loved ones brought back to the United States, or whether they would prefer to have them resting there in their interment cemeteries in honor in Europe. Ballots were sent to nearly 80,000 families in this United States. And when the tallies results and they knew who wanted their sons back in the United States, they again pleaded with the French government, who finally allowed them to take these bones, disinter them from their cemeteries, and bring them to the United States. And when all that happened, the remains of 46,000 soldiers were returned to the states at their family's request, while another 30,000, roughly 40% of that total, were laid to rest in military cemeteries in Europe. When those who were to be interred in the United States came back to the United States, Pershing was there himself to comment at the speech given to the interment of many of these soldiers whose bones were brought back home to America. And after he talked about how they deserved great glory because they had fought for freedom, he said this word: "They gave all, and they have left us their example. It reminds for us with fitting ceremonies, tenderly with our flowers and our tears, to lay them to rest on the American soil for which they died." That is the power of taking the bones and bringing them back to the home. The homes of those who are part of the American story, who were called into duty and gave their life and sacrificed their lives in military conflict. But the stone remembering the bones doesn't always only refer to American soldiers who died in combat. That is true for Memorial Day. But should we not also remember the bones of others who have given, lived, and given their deaths as a part of this American story to the benefit of the American people? I go to Oak Ridge from time to time because we have many of our people, or some of our people, who have their surgeries and procedures done there. And as I drive to Oak Ridge, I get on Highway 53 and head north. And I had noticed on one of those trips, and then several times after, a little sign that said African Burial Ground off of that highway. One day, I decided I wanted to visit that burial ground. What an experience to walk upon that little plot of land that had the bones of African slaves. They've made a way to remember the bones as they've erected a small fence, a few grave markers, because not all the graves are marked. And there is a stone marker that was wonderfully crafted and worded. What that stone marker says is this: Wheat Community, because that was in Wheat, Tennessee. Wheat Community, African Burial Ground, Roane County, Tennessee. The cemetery and the memorial is dedicated to the memory of these Africans who were in America in bondage rather than by choice. And they lived, worked, and died in bondage in the Wheat community. Understand that those who were brought for some reason, not by their own choice, still lived and died among us and became a part of the American story, and they are a part of the American family. They are our people. And to be there where they too are buried and remember who they were and what they have given. And after that word of what the Wheat Cemetery African Burial Ground is about, on that wonderful stone memorial, there then follows a poem written by Isaac Watts. When I read my title clear to mansions in the sky, I bid farewell to every fear and wipe my weeping eyes. It's a good place for us to jump from how we share the American story with others that we love. We're of all different kinds. Some of us are not so good at being a family member. Others of us are better. But we never throw anyone out of the American story. They're our brothers and sisters. And here to consider, to remember the bones, remembers the bones of all the Americans that we love and who we see as a part of who we are. But to speak about these slaves looking towards their mansions in the skies and bidding farewell to the fear and the tears that they experienced living here among us is a good way to talk about another narrative. I'm an American. I want the narrative of the American story. I embrace it, and I embrace that I'm a fellow American. But there's another narrative that I'm a part of. And in a way, it's underground foundation of my story for my life. It supersedes even my American story in its influence on me. And that's the story of the people of God. When you're looking at this scripture, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. You see, the bones they were carrying were not a tribute to Jacob or a tribute to Joseph. They were seen as a reminder for when these people are on God's journey, that God will rescue them and be there to help them. Why? Because you and I belong to a story where God is the writer. We are his people. And it's his story that we are involved in. It's his story that we live and die in. And it's his story that ties us together. We are a family in Lord, a people who belong to Jesus. And the reason we must remember the bones is, yes, we give credit and thanks and appreciate any other one who is a part of the people of God who gave themselves to that story. But the real reason, or the deeper reason we remember the bones, is it's a sign that God is the writer of the story. And as those people came out of, the people of God came out of Egypt, our loving God knew that they had not yet formed the strength of the people of God to withstand some of the things that would be frightening to them. They could not make it through the Philistia area. He sent them around another way. Not that they weren't ready for battle, but they thought that God thought the battle would be too much for them. They'd be too afraid, and their temptation would be, in the midst of conflict, to return to Egypt, to settle for less than what God had promised them. And brothers and sisters, that's why we remember the bones out of this scriptural passage. We too, as the people of God, run across things that sometimes bring us into despair, sometimes bring us into fear. We run across these places of conflict. Sometimes the conflicts are between us and other people that are part of the American story. Sometimes the conflicts are deep inside of us. And the thing is, we cannot, out of fear or out of despair, turn back and away from God's highest for us. God is the writer of the story. All we need to do is stay within that story. And God will bring us together to a place where we're a blessing for the whole world. And God's life and God's love can then transform this whole earth. Do not God is there to rescue us because we are the people of God. And when he rescues us, it's going to bless the world. We're going to sing now our final hymn, Am I a Soldier of the Cross? We'll sing the first 5 verses. Now, kind of gives us a unique opportunity on Memorial Day to take this image of fighting and dying in conflict for a greater story, see it as the gospel, and try to use that soldier image today to give access to how you are a part of what God is doing in the world, as we all are who belong to him. Am I a soldier of the cross?